We can't hear you, Dr. Kandapan.
Thank you, Dr. Shantini. Before I go to the introduction of the speakers, a quick reminder to everybody. Please keep your cameras on during the digital photo time at the end of the session. We have muted the mic for all the participants all the time to have a smooth flow of sharing session by the speakers. And please post your questions only in the Slido. I think same like previous session. People who have joined newly, we will share the code in the next slide, and also we will post the link in the chat, maybe time to time. And please don't post any questions in the Zoom chat, because we are not going to entertain that, because that has been used for the people to interact or share their contacts and networkings. Please use your full name, as we will be using for attendance and certifications. We have given the permission for you to rename yourself. A poll will be released in the Zoom at the beginning of the interactive Q&A. The question was given by both the speakers. Please complete the poll within 2 to 3 minutes time. Okay, here is the QR code. I think we all used to QR code, as I mentioned earlier. Please take your smartphone, open your camera, take a quick screen of this. If you missed that, don't worry, we will share the link. Okay, thank you, Dr. Shantini. So it was a great privilege for me to be a moderator for this session, especially technology in hospitality and tourism industry and SDGs, which is day 3, session 7, which is very close to me, the topic. So let me give a very quick background of the topic. I think the technology in the hospitality industry, I think it's very important to achieve the sustainability in the current world, because today we are living in a world where the technology has really went to the maximum level of engagement at different levels of the people. There is no luxury people having a smartphone. Now everybody has a smartphone, right? So the technology become very important, or probably a basic requirement nowadays, rather than being a luxury those days. It is very critical for us to only keep track of the latest technological trends in the hospitality and tourism, but it is also very important for us to move with the trend all the time, over the time, because the evolution of the technology always as closely related to the industry revolution. So it is always very important for us to shift with the growing trend of the technology and the industry revolution, because the customers' expectations and the requirements are keep shifting day to day. So as we know, like the technology is always tied up to the SDG, especially in the 17, which is implementation and revitalizing the global partnership, because technology is very much needed to go borderless and to work on different collaborations between countries, nations, or across people. And also the SDG 9, which is focusing on innovation, I think there is a one important element, technology innovation, especially in the hospitality and tourism industry. It plays a predominant role to fulfill the need of the customers, because the current scenario, especially after the millennials, the Gen Z, for them the more focus is towards experience rather than only stopping at satisfaction. So to create a unique experience every time, I think technology can be one of the tools. I'm not saying that it's the only tool. It can be one of the tools to create a unique experience to fulfill the need of the people. And during the COVID, I think the technology has really embraced in across globally, and probably even it has reached to the indigenous or probably even the rural areas, the importance of technology. A quick example, if you want to do a vaccination, I think the QR code is required. So people have started using the technology. I think the QR code will take a next shift in the hospitality industry. So without further ado, let me go to the first speaker. We have an eminent speaker all the way joining us from virtually from UK, Dr. Alisha Ali, who is a principal lecturer and researcher and innovation lead for the Department for Service Sector Management at Sheffield Hallam University at UK. Thank you, Dr. Alisha, for joining us and taking your time to share with us today. And she's an interdisciplinary and international recognition researcher studying the sustainable development of hospitality and tourism, focusing especially on ICT, social responsibility, entrepreneurship, working conditions, hospitality and tourism education. She also served as a guest editor and published over 40 reputed articles, that means well-recognized article in reputed journals. She won the Council for Hospitality Management Education and also Smith Travel Share Award for Innovation in Teaching and Learning with her colleague. So she also recently working for a journal which is very close to the same title, Technology in Tourism and Hospitality to Achieve the SDG. I think there is a call for paper. Probably people who are interested to submit your paper, try to reach her through her LinkedIn or maybe social media or probably her working email. Without further ado, I will pass the virtual screen to our first speaker for this session, Dr. Alisha. The screen is yours, Dr. Alisha.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And warm greetings to everyone for whichever part of the world you're joining us. I know for some of you it might be very early morning or late at night, so it's an absolute pleasure for me to be here with you all today. So I have 30 minutes, and in that 30 minutes, I'm going to do what I call a whistle stop in terms of technology in hospitality and tourism industry and the SDGs. I'm going to do an introductory session on this, and my colleague Tham, who will be presenting after me, will do a session which is a bit more in-depth and looked at some of the future technologies. But I thought we would start off today by having that introduction to set the stage in terms of this dynamic field, which we're all researching, but it's really relevant to the topic at hand today. But before I start off, I always would say to people that while I research in technology, I'm an imposter. I'm a technology imposter. And the reason I say this is because I still keep a lot of old technology, which is very dear to my heart. So I don't know if many of you or some of you remember diskettes. I don't know. I show this to my students and they ask me, what am I showing them? They have never seen this before. But when I was doing my master's dissertation, I had, this is what, this is your USB or your cloud today. All my work was saved on this, and I would be carrying around 2 boxes of this because the disk space was quite limited. I still have my mobile phone. I still have, cassette. I even have a cassette recorded, which I used to record, my first color TV, PC. And the reason I'm saying these things to you is that in terms of understanding the role of technology for the SDGs, you don't have to be a computer programmer. You don't have to be a hardware expert. The key thing is about understanding the applications of those technologies. So whilst I may not design technology, I understand the application and the benefits and the use of those technologies. And that's really important for us in terms of conceptualizing how we can actually engage with the technology for the SDGs. So you can be imposters like me and still be able to understand those applications and make an impact in our hospitality and tourism industry. So today, what I'm going to cover with you are 3 key things. We're going to look at the role of technology for sustainable tourism development. We're going to focus on the key stakeholders and the technologies they can engage with. And then we're going to consider some critical success factors, but Aaron will cover this a bit more in depth in his session in terms of the affordances, but I'll start to touch on them, and then he'll pick those up later in his session in terms of the role of technology. And in my presentation, I'm also going to ask you to challenge yourself. You don't have to give me these answers, but it's for you to think about as we go through the presentation. And we spoke about this a little bit in the introduction to the session, but it's thinking about technology and how much in touch with technology we are. So can any of you actually go a full 24 hours without being connected? So that's my first challenge. Think about this. Can you go 1 hour without being connected? Can you go through this entire 30-minute presentation with me without looking at another social media forum or your phone or some other type of device? Now, I'm not going to be offended if you do, because I'm sure you're going on Facebook or Twitter to say how great this summer school is, which is wonderful. So keep doing that. But it's just to give you the idea that we're all connected. And a recent study by Oxford Economics says by 2027, each of us on average will be connected to 15 devices a day. So that's not just your phone or your computer or your tablet, but it's also your refrigerator, it's also your car, it's also your clothing that you wear, it's also your heating. So just think about how connected we are. And if we harness that power of connectivity, what value we can do in terms of creating impact and change for our tourism industry. And then that next brings me to my next slide, which is really conceptualized in what future do we want for our hospitality and tourism industry. We are in a sustainability crisis, and you would have probably heard this from a lot of the other speakers. You know, our industry is not as sustainable as it has been before. Actually, in some of the research is showing that we're actually less sustainable than we've ever been. So what kind of future do we want for our industry? Do we want the future with the photo on the left, or do we want somebody saying that they cannot
Yeah,
see my slides?
sorry, Dr. Alisha, we cannot see your slides.
I think you're
Okay.
not sharing.
You are
I
not
thought,
sharing your slides.
okay,
Let's
hold on,
check.
hold on,
Yeah, sure.
hold on. 1 second.
Maybe you can stop and reshare.
Yeah.
Yes,
I
now
think
we
you should
can
be
see.
seeing my slides. Okay. Well, given that bit of excitement with technology, I told you all I was an imposter earlier on. So I'll start back. I'll just go a quick whistles from the beginning. So that was the introductory slide which we missed. That was my imposter photos, where you can actually see photos of all the things I still have collected, if you missed that. And then the learning outcomes and the challenge, which was really to think about how long can you actually go without technology. Is very difficult. I think most of us, as soon as we wake up, we grab our phone. And this is where we were at in terms of thinking about what future do we want for hospitality and tourism industry. What is the future, and what do we want to build for ourselves? And in looking at the role of technology for sustainable tourism and the SDGs, I will use the term a lot of technology, but when I'm talking about technology, I'm really referring to the term ICT, information and communication technology. This is really around the technology required for information processing. So it's your cell phone applications, it's the internet, it's wireless, it's VoIP, it's location-based services, it's GPS, and then all the hardware which is needed to make that happen. So your actual cell phone, your cables, your satellites, your mobile systems. It's that information which is required for information processing is really the technology which I will be focusing on. And that's, you know, looking really at the role of the ICT and how it can enable sustainable tourism development and, in essence, the sustainable development goals. So what is this link that I keep mentioning between ICT and sustainable tourism development and, in essence, the SDGs? So we all know sustainable tourism is a very well-developed, mature field, and similarly e-tourism. But a new and emerging field which is gaining traction is that relationship between ICT and sustainability, because ICT is creating opportunities for significant sustainable changes from both a technical perspective, but also a consumer and engagement perspective. So it's offering ways in which we haven't thought about how we can actually manage the environment, because it's looking at ways to give us access to information to allow us to make decisions more quicker. It's also allowing us to map and monitor the economic impacts that are happening in the industry, leading to economic sustainability. It can also be used to manage and identify sensitive areas for tourism development and how we control and manage those areas at risk. And it can also help us by providing quick and up-to-date information to tourists, but also information about their consumption patterns, which can help them to become better consumers when they visit our destination. ICT is also important in terms of the sustainability journey for us, because it also supports our local communities. Local communities are at the heart of tourism development, and therefore it also gives them a way to have their voice heard in the tourism development process, but also to be able to achieve their livelihood. And it also helps to protect our cultural and heritage assets. So therefore, this role of ICT in sustainable tourism development is really important, because it's giving us a toolkit which we didn't have before to help us manage the industry. And that's why this link is critically important. So it's a new and uncommon area of research. So therefore, if one that you're interested in, you can always get in touch with me or my colleague afterwards to discuss this area, because again, it's quite exciting in terms of the future that it holds for us in tourism development. But what I want to focus on are the key stakeholders in this process. I can't focus on all the key stakeholders today, but I'll focus on three groups of key stakeholders and their role in terms of how they can actually engage with using these technologies for sustainable tourism development. So the three stakeholders I'll touch on are tourism planners, local communities, and the tourists. So in terms of the tourism planners have a challenging job, I think, because destinations are very complex, they're very diverse, they're very dynamic. And you have a large number of stakeholders in destinations, and you also have destinations within destinations. But the key ingredient that tourism planners need to keep thinking about is that the environment is the backbone of a tourism industry. There's a very famous quote which says that, the environment is the lifeblood of tourism. And there's also another very famous quote which says technology is the lifeblood of tourism. So therefore, combining them both, it's quite important in terms of a tourism planning perspective to think about how we can use technology to actually enrich our environment, but also provide those economic benefits and support our local communities in terms of that tourism development. And I've identified 4 tools, which I call them tools, but they're in terms of the ICT, which tourism planners might think about using. And some tourism planners have actually started to engage with these tools in terms of how they plan their tourism development. The first tool I have here is computer simulation. And basically what that does, it simulates future scenarios and future outcomes, which are too difficult to be observed directly. So sometimes when planning tourism development, certain things you cannot see directly, and computer simulation can help you predict things such as capacity issues, visitor usage patterns. They can monitor tracking systems and other critical components which may pose threats to the system. And by having this information, again, it helps planners make really timely but also valid decisions in terms of how they can manage their tourism development. We also have Geographical Information System, GIS, and there's a whole body of research developed towards GIS, as well as journals and research outputs around GIS. But again, GIS is really well known for planning, and therefore it can be used to support tourism development and tourism planning, because what GIS does, it uses spatial and non-spatial data, and it maps that data to help us to be able to understand how an area is used currently and how that area can be used over time. And therefore it can help us again manage our sustainability concerns. So as a tourism planner, you can probably use a GIS to do a resource inventory of your area to understand the land use over time. You can also use it to help think about your sustainability developments in terms of what areas you want to develop, which areas you don't want to develop, because a GIS can help you map that also. Drones are also starting to be used more frequently in tourism planning and development, because drones, because of how they were developed and how they can fly, they can get into areas and give images of areas which are not easy to get to if you're considering looking at how you protect your areas and your natural resources. And the drones can also gather rich intelligence, which is, again, is not really directly observable. And then mapping that information with the drones and the GIS can really give you a rich picture of what your destination look like to help you with your planning. Another tool planners can use is have specialist software. So there is environmental impact analysis software, which a lot of the national parks use to help track and monitor their waste and look at their emissions and how they manage that, and look at how they recycle all of their materials. A lot of destinations also use economic impact analysis software to manage the economic impact and how they trade that off with the environmental and social cultural impacts. So that's just a small snapshot of some of the tools as a tourism planner you might want to think about engaging with if you're trying to look at how you can use technology to help you plan your destination. We then move on to looking at local communities. And in the literature since the 1970s, in the development literature, it has spoken about the need for local communities to be involved in development issues which affect them. because community involvement is really significant in achieving sustainable development. So communities are at the heart of sustainable development, and communities are at the heart of our sustainable tourism development. Additionally, some of the communities who are most impacted live in rural areas, and therefore their views need to be considered because their significance for sustainable development is critical. And therefore, communities also need to be empowered to be able to share information, but also have that voice in terms of how tourism is developed for them and for their local area. And these are some tools which, you know, as a tourism planner, you can use to work with local communities to make sure their voice are part of that process. And one area is community informatics. Again, this is a very well-established field. There is a Journal of Community Informatics if you want to delve deeper into this field. But community informatics was really founded by Gerstein, and he said it's an enabling and empowering communities to realize the objectives through the use of ICT. So that's really important in terms of it giving communities the tools to be able to give them a voice, to support them in how they develop their industry. So it's about giving community access, it's about empowering communities, it's allowing them to have representation, and it's also about giving marginalized groups a voice to make sure tourism is developed to benefit them. Similar to community informatics, I spoke about computer simulation and GIS earlier on. The outputs, the simulations that you get from the computer simulation and the GIS can also be used to speak to communities about what proposed developments look like. So you're giving them better information in terms of what proposed development might look like 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line. So therefore they have more information in order to make decisions about what is happening to them. And I wouldn't be able to talk about, you know, ICT for the SDGs without talking about the sharing economy and talking about access and sharing, because the sharing economy, we all know it. We probably all use Uber, we all use Airbnb, or, you know, Lyft or Rideshare or any of these sort of other online platforms in terms of how we share things. But sharing economy is quite interesting because the sharing economy was seen as, you know, when it developed, it was facilitated through ICT. So without ICT, the sharing economy wouldn't be facilitated. But also, it was an approach in terms of sustainable consumption. We were sharing resources which was spare without creating new resources, or sharing resources, you know, reusing shared space. However, so again, with the power of the internet, it has allowed communities to be able to access a means of wealth for themselves by being able to put their business online, and it has allowed them to manage their own tourism development in a certain way through the sharing economy. So for example, in certain countries, communities manage their own tourism by sharing their culture. There are websites such as mealsharing.com or eatwithme.com where you can go and book a meal with a local family in their home. So again, it's thinking about how the internet is opening up that access and communities. There's tours by local where you can book a tour directly with a local local person from that local area, so you get that more authentic experience. So again, it's thinking about how the ICT is allowing communities to be able to create their own livelihoods for themselves and empower themselves in that tourism development process. So I'll move on to the last group of stakeholders, which is the tourists. And I'm sure when we've all been on holidays, whether for leisure trips, or if we go on leisure trips, you know, mixing business and leisure, or just for business, is thinking about, as a tourist, what is my role in that sustainable development process? Do you even think about your role as a tourist in terms of how you use technology for that sustainable tourism development process and achieving the SDGs? Many times tourists do not think about that, because a lot of time the consumption of hospitality and tourism is hedonistic. So therefore they don't think about, that because they're on a pleasure journey of enjoyment, and sometimes, you know, this this is something they're not concerned about. But as tourists, we all have a role to play in terms of making sure the industry which we enjoy so much and the destinations and the places we like to visit actually is here to stay. And there are a couple of things which as a destination planner you can enact and encourage and educate tourists to become more aware of the environment and the local environment they're in, and also make more sustainable decisions and better consumption decisions as part of that process. And some of these tools are gamification. So gamification is really where you use game design elements in non-game design context. Is based on the principles of rewards and emotions. So, you know, tourism planners pre-arrival can create gamified experiences for tourists to have before they arrive, to allow them to see, you know, what their choices at a destination might bring, and therefore allow them to probably make better choices when they're at the destination. Research, you know, which has been done recently shows that through gamification, there is a great possibility that actually tourists will engage in sustainable behaviors at the destination. So destination planners, again, can play a real role in looking at how they can gamify experiences to promote sustainable development and the SDGs. We also have virtual reality and augmented reality, which again are technologies which can use to support that experience. And you can use this to supplement an existing experience, or you can use this to give tourists an alternative to the experience. So virtual reality can act as a substitute for an actual tourist experience. So you can have an experience free of the usual restrictions, which lessens the environmental impact. Some museums are using this in terms of interpretation. Other destinations are using this to augment the experience that's really happening there. And the same applies for augmented reality, because it can improve the tourist experience. And that's quite important, again, because you're educating the tourists about their impacts when they're at the destination. And the more you can educate the tourists about their impacts through using these technology, the greater chance you have that they will have better consumption behavior when they're at the destination, thereby contributing to the sustainable development goals. We also have mobile technologies. Again, imagine if you're in a destination, you don't have access to any information such as signage, maps, brochures, travel routes. Your mobile phones can help you do that. And as a destination planner, you can feed that information into tourists to help you do that. You can also embed carbon calculators in the information that you feed to tourists via the mobile technology, again, to help them make those choices. A study done by Kang and Gretzel in 2012 found that listening to interpretive podcasts on mobile phones while visiting national parks can actually improve a tourist's environmental stewardship. So again, there is evidence showing that, you know, use of these technologies can actually help tourists make better choices. And again, social media, we're all on social media, different channels, and social media is quite a powerful tool now. And there are lots of influencers. So again, social media can be used in different ways to influence how people consume. You know, a big trend right now is around food waste. So food shaming, food waste, you know, people wasting food. So again, how can you use that in a positive way to encourage tourists to have better consumption behavior when at the destination? So moving on, I bring it to my second challenge. So my first challenge was really to ask you to think about, you know, how long can you go without any technology? My second challenge is for you to think about, as a tourist, you know, when you are on holiday or when you visit in a destination, have you in the past engaged with technology to consume more sustainably? Or is this something you're going to think about in the future in terms of what you can do as a tourist when you're on that at the destination in terms of how you can consume? So that's my second challenge for you, is think about yourself, put yourself in the role of a tourist and think about, you know, when I next go on holiday, when I next go to visit, what can I do in terms of improving my consumption patterns? So I'm coming to the end now. I'm just going to conclude with a few more slides. So just to sum up, ICTs can contribute to all aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals. It contributes to the triple bottom line in terms of environmental, social, cultural, and economic sustainability. In terms of environmental sustainability, we're looking at things here like, having an inventory, a resource inventory of our local area. We're looking at things like how we can identify suitable areas for tourism development. I also use it to probably identify damaged areas and how we get those areas to recover from being damaged. It's also looking at how we manage the destination resources, how we manage our sites and attractions, how we manage our tourist flows and track our tourist movement. In terms of social cultural sustainability, we're looking at how we give, local communities that social equity and preserve the cultural richness and the well-being of our local communities. And it's about the economic in terms of how we create that memorable experience for our tourists, that visitor enjoyment, but at the same time providing quality employment and local prosperity. So technology can harness all of these in terms of producing a more sustainable tourism industry. So on this slide, I just have a table to summarize what I've just been speaking about. So I've listed the 3 core groups of stakeholders. I haven't gone through all the technology. I've put them there because we don't have the time to discuss them all in depth. And then I've put the sustainable development goal in terms of, how these technologies can actually make a contribution to the sustainable development goals. So if I just pick one, which is local communities, giving communities that voice to the different technologies and engaging with them through technology, you can really help to reduce inequality and create more inclusive society, which links directly back to, to the SDG and our role in tourism in supporting this. So it brings me to my last slide in terms of the critical success factors. Now, there are tons of critical success factors. We can talk about cost, fitness for purpose, people understanding the use of technology and the value, but there are 2 which I really want to talk about, which is very important to think about. One is the negative impacts of technology itself. So we talk a lot about how technology can be of value to us, but technology, the production of technology itself, green waste, has an impact. So in terms of looking at how we actually manage our tourism industry, we need to also consider the cost implications of the use of technologies, because technology itself, the production of your mobile phone, the production of your laptop, all of these things come at an environmental cost. And how do we outweigh that cost? So that's something to really think about in terms of that process. And the second one is around the digital divide, because whilst we are all connected to each other today online, and it's wonderful to meet all of you, there are many parts of the world which still aren't connected, or which don't have good internet access, or don't have access to the types of technology. So whilst we want to implement these technologies for the SDGs, we need to think about those communities which are hard to reach, who will not have access to these technologies, and how we make sure that they're included as part of this process. Because to successfully leverage any of the technologies I just spoke about, tourism planners and businesses must clearly understand the factors for the uptake, but they need to understand their destination and the stage of development which their destination is at, and they need to marry those 2 together, because they need to go hand in hand. And ideally, if you're looking at ICTs for the Sustainable Development Goal, it should come at the start of any tourism development process, but a lot of destinations haven't started with it. So therefore, you need to really consider how it's going to make meaningful impact now. But engaging with these technologies, is very necessary if destinations are going to be successful in the long run, because it's critical for them in terms of how they engage with the new tourists, but also how they manage their resources to make sure they keep tourists coming back to their destinations. So thank you for your time. That was a very quick chat around technology for sustainable development, but if you have any questions, we have a session afterwards which you can ask your questions. And then I have a slide with some further reading. If this is a topic you want to pursue further, there is some readings which you can further look at to help you develop your knowledge of this further. Please feel free to contact me and we can have a chat outside of this session. But thank you for your time, and I will stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alisha. I think it was very enlightening and sparking sharing session. on the technology in hospitality and tourism industry. I think all the participants start complimenting your presentation and sharing already. So without further ado, let me go to the second speaker. We have all the way from Australia joining us Dr. Aaron Tham. So he is a lecturer and researcher in the USC Business School with a focus in tourism and hospitality. Aaron has published more than 60 to 70 articles. I've seen his list, even in 2021, a list of publication relevant to the technology and sustainable and tourism. And he also has been a reviewer across several journals, and his area of specialization includes social media, tourism marketing, and branding, culture, and heritage in Asia. He also have a work experience in with a Japanese tourism agency for inbound and outbound markets, including corporate clients, and he has almost getting closer to 1 decade of academic experience. And he also been a professional member in many bodies like APACRI, then APTA, okay, Asia Pacific Tourism Association, International Federation for International Information Technology in Travel and Tourism. And also he got a lot of awards during his studies, especially the one would I like to highlight is the Giffith Award for Academic Excellence. His session will focus more on technology and SDGs, same like Dr. Alisha, but he will focus more on the applications, and also he will try to cover the props, that difficulties in the technology adaptations, arguing that such tools can come to an expense of unaffordability and ethical considerations. So without further ado, I will pass the virtual screen to our second speaker for today's session, Dr. Aaron.
Thank you, Kanapan. I will share my screen. And I hope you can all see me and hear me.
Yes, yes,
Thank you.
yes.
Well, welcome and many thanks for the opportunity to share some of the work and some of the observations around the emerging good and best practices of where technology has fit into the sustainable development goals. And I had the privilege of listening in as well to what Alisha was mentioning earlier in the previous session on the broad constructs of where technology underpins some of the work that we do. I am in Australia, and it is obviously important that I acknowledge that we're also standing on Indigenous and ethnic communities' lands on which we develop knowledge, both past, present, and emerging leaders. And importantly as well, without them, there will be no sustainable development to speak of. So it is important that we also recognize that there's a multifaceted ways to think about sustainability, particularly in a non-English speaking environment. So here is a bit of the agenda in the next couple of minutes to share where technology appears to have that fit for purpose into tourism and particularly the sustainable development goals. We will look at some of the costs and affordances of what can everyone actually be part of this conversation, asking ourselves the very hard questions. What are the ethical dilemmas when we engage with technology? What are we actually giving up in exchange for convenience, for efficiency, and so on? And lastly, to also open up some research directions that will then prompt further discussion, hopefully, as we have time for question and answers. So here are some pictures of emerging technologies, and I use the word emerging in a very broad and inclusive space. The picture on the left is Pepper, and many of you may have seen pictures of the robot in action. Pepper serves a lot of functions in Japan, where I was back in 2019, where we still could travel. It will be able to take you to your table, help you order your food, ask how your day is, get you your bill, and many other functions as well. And last week here in Brisbane, I also visited a restaurant that actually served me food on a robot. So clearly the landscape is fast evolving. The other pictures that you see on the screen, things like virtual reality and also QR codes, are also part of where we are now starting to embrace, particularly in the pandemic, things like contact tracing and some of this understanding behind the parameters of safety for public health reasons. What I wanted to do is to bring you through a bit of a snapshot of where some of these exemplars of technology as applied to different SDGs. It is quite uncommon, as Alisha has alluded to, that one piece of technology will solve or address all 17 SDGs. That's probably quite unlikely. Rather, we have to think about the service design, some principles of design thinking, what is the technology meant to do. So in this particular case, I use the example SDG 15, where we've got life on land, and in many instances, animals, wildlife, plants can get injured or damaged as a result of bushfires, accidents, and so on. So in the pictures that you see is a tortoise that was injured in a bit of a big fire, lost pretty much 80% of its shell. And through 3D printing, designers, IT programmers, and wildlife enthusiasts were able to recreate a new shell for the tortoise. Seems to be going very well for Freddy. And so if you follow the case of Freddy, you can see how technology has managed to give it a new lease of life, a new code in itself. And clearly, this could be applied to other animals who might have lost a limb, and you can think of artificial limbs these days, artificial feet or hands to actually help support some of the functions of whether it be a deer, a horse, and so on. Also, the way that we use technology, as Alisha has mentioned previously, is in the area of drones. And in SDG 14, we'll be looking at life below water. The use of drones can actually help us understand a little bit about animal migration patterns and behavior, such as whales and other forms of animal migration behaviors. This can actually support clearly conservation outcomes, knowing a bit more about how global warming or climate change has actually impacted their path of migration. But in that as well, we now need to understand that the animals themselves also react to technology. And often we see, oh, this is quite cool technology to adopt. We're so close to it. You get it up close and visual experience. It helps people who are seasick, not necessarily having to go onto boats to see the whales. But they also emit quite loud noises, usually in the range of 65 to 130 decibels. And for a whale, that can actually throw it off course. Some animals don't like it. The eagles have been known to claw away at drones. But what we're seeing is how the technology needs to be learned in terms of where it's positioned, for how long, how high above the water. And now each country would have its own provisions of rules and regulations to ensure that the technology doesn't compromise the quality or the way that the animals behave in their natural environment. We also then look at fast emerging landscapes, SDG 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure. And in this slide, I use a simple analogy where we've thought of blockchain and the distributed ledger space, looking at a whole range of cryptocurrencies, obviously Bitcoin, Ethereum, Dash, and many others in the different countries. What it's done is it's given island economies and different businesses almost what we call a new lease of way to think about new economies. I almost like to refer to this as a bit of destination shareholders, where in the absence of tourism, many countries heavily reliant on tourists and funding and resourcing are not able to actually generate the income. So there has been hefty job losses throughout the world in different countries, many of them not knowing whether they'll return. But places like Aruba in the slide have actually tried to recreate a new economy powered by blockchain and cryptocurrencies. Yes, there is huge question marks about legality, ethics, whether we can actually manage it in a more sustainable landscape, looking at the cost and energy consumption out of encrypting the data. But I've done some work in this space, and it is a fascinating movement as well, how different countries are starting to witness this and say, well, how can we ensure that the volatility of things like Bitcoins and its valuation almost on a daily basis doesn't impact on the earning potential for destinations. SDG 11 also looks at the way we rethink sustainable cities and communities. So things like big data and visitor tracking technologies can empower destinations to know a bit more about consumer behavior through the course of their journeys. So in the two pictures on the left, you've got the I Am Amsterdam app and Play London, and these are examples of gamification or big data where they push information to tell us a bit and address things of over tourism. In the case of I Amsterdam, what they've done is they collected visitor movements across the city. And what they found is prior to the launch of big data, people would often go into the museum in the morning and do the canal cruise in the afternoon. This actually shifted the domain because in some places it was quite overcrowded, in other places there was almost nobody. So with this data embedded onto the chips, onto mobile phones and devices and tablets, you would be able to see where the traffic hotspots were and avoid those areas to go into less congregated areas. And that was quite powerful because it gave everyone an equal chance to see the city without necessarily embarking on the long wait queues and times. Play in London was another example that was used using a character like Mr. Bean, allowing people to actually engage in different parts of London, putting on some of their favorite icons there, and they could actually track where people went, what they did, and how to plan routes according to the modes of public transport and so on. One of my favorite examples on the right-hand side is by the work of Professor Anne Hardy and other colleagues in the University of Tasmania and Tourism Tasmania. Tourism Tracer is one of the first in the world to launch a digital tourism visitor dashboard. So through data collected at entry points like airports and seaports, they were able to get people into the city and in across the state to know where they went. And the hotspots would actually tell you over a 7-day or 5-day period what was the path they took. The spots that you see as the hotspots are areas where there was a lot of visitor traffic during those times. And this allowed the destination to think of, do we need new lanes for the freeway? Do we need extra toilets? It's become quite a successful model. I do encourage many of you to look up the website on Tourism Tracer. The concept has been replicated in places like Sweden and Japan, where they too have learned a lot more and create more sustainable ventures out of visitor tracking devices. Climate action as well. Well, as we start to think of ways to combat and mitigate our carbon footprint, countries in Europe are starting to go very much in this landscape and advocating or legislating policies and plans to have driverless cars, autonomous cars, electric cars that allow us to actually be safe, but at the same time also get around with less reliance on fuel and other forms of less sustainable energy. It's not easy, but as we start to also think about this as well, countries like France are also saying, well, destinations or places with a less than 2-hour flight time in the country, those short haul flights will actually be banned and will be replaced by long haul trains and buses and cars. So you can see how they are trying to address the landscape of autonomous and going into electric mobility.
Sorry, Dr. Aaron. I think
Yeah.
every time we are getting a black box on the slide.
Okay. Let me just
You want to
stop sharing.
and reshare again?
Let me just stop share
Thank you.
and reshare. That's all right. Is this better now?
It's loading. Still, we are seeing the black boxes.
Full of my screen. Do you see it better now?
But the bottom is black box.
Okay, that's interesting. Give me a minute.
Sure.
I'll share my screen again and see how we go. Is that better?
Except the black box. Yeah. Okay. I think you are
Still
removing
there?
more. Okay, that's one more.
Yep.
I think on the bottom, you can remove that. It's fine to go. Yeah, that one. On the
Is it
bottom,
gone?
after the fueling A, there is a box.
If I move this away, I wonder if it will do anything to it. It's just better now?
It went up actually.
I
Yeah. Okay. Now at least
really?
it goes
Okay.
to the
That's right.
top.
That's right.
It doesn't
Okay.
block.
Yeah. How interesting. I never had this. What if I can move this box out of my screen?
Is there any embedded video inside your slides?
No, I've removed all the videos. It's interesting. It's okay. That's all right. I just shared my screen and
Yeah, it appears and
maximized it.
disappears
So
actually.
yeah, I don't see that on my screen, so I do apologize. I'll send the slides
No
through
worries.
again. That's right. So on to SDG 7, and this is where we're starting to even see aviation, which is often the one that many people find culpable of emitting high amounts of carbon footprint, and because of the distances that they go to, and therefore consume more and more of the fuel. This is where sustainable aviation comes in. It's still very early steps. We're talking about really stages of infancy. We were looking at how airlines are working with a lot of new fossil fuels to think of ways to create sustainable aviation. Here in Australia, there's now chat on developing almost like what we call battery packs for airlines. And this is really early days to be able to see whether one is safe, two, it's economical to run, and three, how much of it can we source to be able to support the aviation industry. And this year, particularly the last year and a half, where we started to see more of the airlines remaining grounded because of the lack of international air travel in parts of the world, they're now starting to experiment with this and trying to see if there is possible ways to actually fast track some of these developments and supporting businesses to create sustainable fuels. We have the question as well on costs and affordances. This is a key one here as we were reflecting on what Alisha was saying earlier as well, is that there are some challenges and concerns in relation to whether technology can reach all of the tourism sectors and sizes. Some of the big picture that we start to engage with and realize is many of our tourism organizations are mostly small and medium enterprises. There are also things that we are starting to think about in terms of the infrastructure and workforce development. Right now, many businesses are not necessarily at the level of their income or that they can actually hire more staff in that space. So we also start to see the different infrastructure not necessarily having the universal compatibility. Right? Not everyone is prepared to release their geofences for fear of hacking and cyber terrorism, for example. And so having this almost utopic view of technology and sustainability can be problematic in and of itself. There are also some areas where translation interpretation needs to be corrected or made more accurate in this current day and time. Even as we look at things like Google Translate, it's a very crude tool, and we realize that they don't necessarily move in the same way, but we want a more accurate or succinct translation or interpretation as part of the landscape. And finally, as well, we also don't know at this point in time, well, who owns the intellectual property that's been created? Where does the big data stay, and how are they using it? If they are with Facebook, we can see the privacy issues as well. If they're with Apple, if they're with Google and so on, what happens in 20 to 30 years or 50 years time? What happens to our next generations looking back at this data and say, well, hold on, can I have access to this because it was from my grandparent or from my family lineage? And this is something that we don't necessarily have as well, because each day, as what we see in our technological footprint, we're giving up information almost on a hourly, if not on a minutes basis. The hard questions and asking ourselves as well, who owns this big data and how much technology is too much? Can we actually go what we call a technology detox in a time when many of us face things like Zoom fatigue, or teaching online or learning online, or just engaging with consumers online? Are we prepared to pay more for technology to be adopted? The onset or the cost of embarking on technology is never easy for businesses who talk about returns on investments and break-even points, for example, and therefore pass this cost on to you and I as consumers. What about giving up greater privacy to be in the ecosystem of the future? And this is where GDPR comes in terms of looking at the landscapes of what post-pandemic futures are. I don't dare use the word post-pandemic. I think many of us are still in second to fifth cycles of the pandemic. So this kind of privacy issues become quite challenging as we speak. Avenues for future research agenda, looking at accessibility. What if people can't travel because of certain costs or handicap reasons and want to yet be part of this big picture? What are the cross-cultural influences? Many of us are from different parts of the world, and how do the different stakeholders, young, old, different ethnic groups, what do they see and how do they engage in tourism and technology? Can we have more or better technology to support or preserve cultural heritage? And I'm reading that even as we progress, there's a lot of people who actually are a bit more concerned that technology may come at the expense of conserving heritage, where a lot of indigenous knowledge can be lost almost on an annual basis. Intergenerational perceptions, right? What does the generation future want and expect out of the technology in a tourism hospitality concept? Are they quite happy to do this? Are they going to be growing up with robots and not necessarily people in the workforce? And what does that do in terms of their development professionally? Finally, as well, the way we think about service and redesign. Right? Many of us understand now what it means to have contactless service, but what is the right balance for each business, whether you're in the cruise industry, aviation, restaurants, accommodation, and so on. I think there's a lot of open conversations that we need to speak about. And as we recover slowly, what does that actually look like as well in terms of incorporating a safe passage for tourist mobility around the world? So that's all from me. I will stop screen and give that floor back to you, Kanapan, for question and answers.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Aaron. Sorry for indicating you about that slide issue, but it was good.
That's right.
Yeah, I think I should thank first of all both the speaker for managing the time, and I think Dr. Aaron, your sharing was very interesting with the real examples, especially from the international global perspective. Let's move on to the next interactive session. Before that, I would like to announce to the participants, we will release the pool now, which we got few questions from Dr. Alisha and Dr. Aaron. They are also very curious to know the results of their questions. So we will launch the pool now. It's already launched and the result will be shared later. The pool is open for next 2 to 3 minutes. Okay, let's go to the interesting part of every session. Is always an interactive Q&A session. Of course, we got number of questions, but we will try to take few questions and we have compiled few. Thanks to Ms. Zuratul, my first like another moderator who's compiling the questions from Slido and passing to me. We have the first question. I will start with Dr. Alisha because being an hospitality, we start always with ladies first. Okay. We have a question from Dr. Vicky and Mr. Dotik. Will virtual tour and virtual reality, which are currently in trend, will replace traditional currently in trend, replace the traditional tours and activities? As the tour experience will never be the same via technology, will the business will survive? There is a question. Let me repeat the question. Will virtual tour and VR replace the traditional tour and activities? As the tour experience will never be the same via technology, will the business survive? Dr. Alisha?
Yep. To answer, I think yes, the business will survive, but I think as tour guides and tour operators, you need to innovate your business model to account for the changes which are happening with consumer behavior. So whilst we will have virtual tools being used that can use to augment the experience that you are given to the tourists when they're there, I don't think any technology will replace the actual experience, but what I think the technology will do is to make that experience better and more realistic. But also, I think it also forces us as hospitality providers to really look at our business models and really figure out how we can innovate. And we've seen a lot of this happen during the pandemic where, we were forced to close our businesses suddenly, and food providers, hotels, I think everybody in the hospitality and tourism industry had to rethink their business model and what is their value proposition that they're offering to consumers. So I think you have to relook at, what is your value proposition and then look at how the technology fits into that.
Thank you, Dr. Alisha. I think you have explained in a very holistic way. And I think this question also touched a little bit of Dr. Aaron because he also shared a bit more on drones and virtual reality. Would you like to add some insight from your perspective, Dr. Aaron?
Yeah, in reflecting as well, I think many of the businesses are also starting to think about the costs associated with virtual events and whether or not people make it out to be cheaper. I don't necessarily think they're actually cheaper. I think they're actually more complex because you got to get it right. Uh, it's quite tiring as well for all of us to actually sit through virtual events like for conferences for 3 days in a row. It's not the same as being in a room where you can actually take a breath and catch up with other people, because when you're listening to presentations for 5 hours in a row, it can be quite draining, and your attention span actually will waver over a period of time. The other thing is, well, there are ways to blend the virtual with the what we call the hybrid events, and I'm thinking in terms of the mine sector in particular. I was just being observing how some of our counterparts in Vietnam were running some of their events where they were sending like the goodie bags to the houses of delegates while the session was on like this. So they'll say, okay, now take out your blue goodie bag, and then you open it up and they actually have like a coffee bag in there, or come and take your orange bag and you open it up and there'll be something else. So there's the physical element, but also the virtual element. I think that's what brings back that interaction.
Thank you, Dr. Aaron. I think it's a very interesting point on the hybrid, because I think one of the professor from US, he was sharing for one of the conference, they received the champagne. So they have been told there is a champagne opening time where everybody in the camera open their own bottle, which was sent by the organizer, and they do the chasing. I think that's very interesting. Hybrid is very important. Yeah, true. I totally agree. And let me start this time the question with Dr. Aaron. We got a question. How is opinion to live with technology without losing the original cultures? Let me repeat. How is the opinion to live with technology without losing the original culture?
Yeah, I think that's a valuable question. I think many of us start to also embark on more technology leaning initiatives now from a tourism hospitality standpoint. But I am a sports person, so I watched the opening ceremony of the Olympics, and there was drones performing there as well because there was no audiences, so they were beaming it to a live audience globally. But what I don't think that actually does is it doesn't actually detract on the culture of the host as part of this landscape. And increasingly we start to see as well the small gestures, the kind of cleanliness, the smiles, the warmth, and that can't be replicated with technology. You can't tell a robot and have that honest 20-minute conversation with you because it's programmed to do repetitive stuff. So if you ask the robot, how was your day? You probably not get a response to say it was good, because the robot's just saying, well, tell me what you want me to do, and I'll do it. So that kind of engagement with the heritage and history, I don't think that'll be lost. I think technology can recreate some of these worlds, looking at museums, for example, where you can actually take people back into time. And I think that's quite powerful, because in a time where we can't actually visit many of the museums in the world, that might be an opportunity for us to actually interact and engage with our audiences globally.
Yeah, I think you are well said. The positive and also the consequences and the accessibility of this. Dr. Alisha, would you like to add on from your perspective?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Dr. Aaron said. I think it's about I think the service element will still remain, but I think the technology will preserve traditions which might be otherwise lost. So personally myself, I'm trying to record my parents, because I think some of the things would probably be lost in future years, and that technology can probably be passed on in terms of heritage. So I think the technology can help in that way, but it can also recreate experiences and feelings that we in that interpretive space. So the technology is becoming so advanced to allow us to feel that emotions that our ancestors might have felt, for example, in a battle, or in some other type of experience. I think it is going to augment the experience. I mean, sometimes I remember going to one of the museums, I think was in Hungary, and I was crying because of it. It was just an interpretive experience because of how well they use the technology to show what it was like to be alive in that time during the war. So again, the technology, I think, is becoming better, and with haptic technology coming more to the fore now, where you can actually touch things. So you can touch your phone and make it actually feel like a phone knob that you dial, and not just a screen. I think that that sense as we get to the more six senses. In terms of that, I think we're going to have a better experience.
Okay, that's quite interesting. I think this especially the museums, and especially like a lot of the museum is the place where we see the culture, history. But when the tourists come, not all the countries the museum is not well promoted. But if the museum become an interactive museum, I think there is a very good way to promote and also keep the culture. But always there is a question, people say, okay, when we bring the technology to museum, whether it will replace the human. No, it will create a new job. Especially there may be a person to take care of the augmentation experience manager, maybe a coordinators, right? And I think the other side, just I would like to add on, some countries we are also lack of the tour guides. I think this augmented reality will be a good idea, especially in China, and I think in the US and some many Asian countries they started integrating that. Okay, I think it's a very interesting question. Thanks for posting that from the participants. Okay, we next again. This time we will start with Dr. Alisha. Do you think is the impact of technology on employment and job creation with the highest use of technology in tourism? Take for example the role of tour guide. Let me repeat the question. What do you think is the impact of technology on employment and job creation with the highest use of technology in tourism? Take for example the role of tour guide. I think people like tour guides.
I mean, personally, this is my view. I think the use of technology will create more meaningful employment. Um, I'm speaking from a UK perspective, but in the UK perspective, our hospitality industry still is perceived in quite a negative light. Low pay, long hours, and the nature of the industry is changing. It's no longer like that, but the perception still holds. And I think technology has the potential to create more meaningful work for people. So by having the robots or having the AI or having the different type of technology do the repetitive task, which might be boring to certain people to do, what we can really focus on is creating jobs which have meaning. So how do we design new service experiences for people? How do we keep up with the latest consumer behavior trends? What are the next ways we can manage our workforce? How do we diversify the next segment of the hospitality industry? So I think it is going to create more meaningful work. I think there is a potential and there is a debate right now around, job losses. I think the jobs which might be lost are those which are the repetitive task, but that doesn't mean there will be job losses. I think you will get new jobs coming up where we need those critical thinking skills. So, how do you manage your visitor segments? With big data, do you need new types of people to understand and how you manage that vast amount of data? Is your destination going to create a destination dashboard where they're going to track, different OTAs and then manage that for seasonality? So I think you're going to have more meaningful work for people and hopefully change the perception of what the industry is about. It's not just low pay, long hours working in hotels and restaurants. It's a very diverse, broad sector where you can have a fantastic career depending on which part of the industry you want to go into.
Thank you, Dr. Alisha. I think what I can take in a short note is put the technology in the right place.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Dr. Aaron, maybe before I invite you to add on, I will also add the question, which is quite related, especially from a data perspective. I think Dr. Alisha has touched a little bit on data. Data whispers position is a way forward positioning to look for in the hospitality industry. So data whispers position is a way forward position to look for in the hospitality industry. What is your opinion on that by adding the previous question, Dr. Aaron?
Yeah, kind of on that's a point where countries and destinations are now talking at length about this notion of smart tourism, which is underpinned by data and inform their decision making through multiple sources and real-time data. The challenge with what we call smartness is that you need to have a culture that allows for people to share that information in a safe way whereby they are not necessarily feeling threatened to their business or to their workforce. For a typical hotel, they are measured by a few indicators: RevPAR, room rates, and so on, occupancy, and so on. If they have that information in the wrong hands, like what Alisha says, then you run the risk where they'll hold information back and not want to release that information. So that cultural transformation at the destination level, I don't think we've actually talked very much about that. Now we're just saying, well, where are the rooms and how do we do that? In fact, in many countries, hotels now are almost frowned upon because they are the reason why things like outbreaks happen. So there's almost this like a dark cloud on the hotel industry because they're starting to say, well, what is the path forward? And governments or destinations don't necessarily direct us to that path. The other question on data, and that's an important one, is big data is awfully expensive. If we wanted to get access to big data, I think it would cost us, as an institution or as a country, just a pool of data, whether it be Mastercard data or Expedia data, it probably goes into the 300,000 and beyond on the subscription rate, and not many businesses can afford that kind of money. So we don't necessarily have a very comprehensive big data suite of information yet. We're still working in our ways to get there, but I like to add to what Alisha and where the conversation was in terms of the workforce. I think for us to talk about new ways to engage with technology, we've got to be able to look at the way we actually teach tourism and hospitality in the schools. And that goes not just at the university or the colleges, that actually goes all the way down to primary schools, because this is the Gen Y, Gen Z, and Gen Z plus of the future. The kids of today grow up with technology, use it. I see curriculum like coding and science in different classrooms right from the age like 7, 8, 9, 10. But we need to have the industry also embrace that as well, because we know that our workforce is probably a different generation growing up with technology in a different space, and things like succession planning for generations that are coming to deal with this technology space. I don't think we've got the right blend just yet. I wouldn't be confident to say that the industry is at the moment able to do succession planning, knowing, because we are still evolving as an industry to deal with what the technology is both an enabler but also confronting us in our business model.
Thank you. Thanks for that extensive response, Dr. Aaron. Let me go to a very interesting question as we keep on talking about tour guides and everything. So we have an interesting question from the service quality perspective. What is the impact on service quality when critical high-touch service are replaced with high-tech, especially post-pandemic, that is a post-COVID-19? What is the impact on service quality when critical high-touch service are replaced with high-tech, especially post-COVID-19? So, Dr. Alisha, would you like to start first?
Yeah, I think that's thanks for your question. I think that's a really thought-provoking question. I'm just pausing because I'm reflecting on my whole journey during the pandemic, and also being locked down in terms of high touch versus high tech. But I do believe, especially for small businesses, the pandemic has forced small businesses to up their game in terms of service quality, and they have. And it's also forced them to become more proactive. I mentioned business models, but with their business models, and really understand who their customers are and what is driving value for those customers. So I think from a business perspective, whilst the pandemic was challenging in terms of, we all know, the loss of revenue and being closed down, I think it has really forced those people who are serious in terms of hospitality and tourism to really look at their business model and really come up with something very creative and very innovative, and something which is long lasting. And I think, just to build on Aaron's point earlier on, the generation, kids are being born with technology, so therefore they're expecting to have this technology interface, and therefore it's quite important that the technology is part of that service delivery process. I think we need to look at the the technology aspect in terms of the service user. So sometimes the technology works, but the user gets it wrong, and therefore that compromises the service experience. And therefore, how do you deal with it in that way? But also making sure if you're offering a high-tech service, making sure all the elements work not to frustrate or confuse your customer, because again, that's where the confusion comes from. But I also think you really need to understand who your target market is and what is appealing to them in terms of the technology, because if your target market is really those consumers who are switched on and want high tech, then that's what your business needs to be providing for them. If it's a different consumer group, then you need to think about how you blend that experience. So we talk about the high tech, but the high tech doesn't have to always be front of house. We need to think about back of house service, where we support our employees also in that service delivery process. And that's really important, because if we want to give a more efficient service, we might need to look at the back of house to probably create that high tech to deliver that front of house service. So a lot of times we look at consumer facing technologies, but what about the back of house processes that we need to manage to be able to deliver that high touch service? So I think personally, I think it has upped the game. I think it's also given a lot of businesses different revenue streams. I have been speaking to a number of hoteliers in the local region in terms of how COVID has impacted them. And for many of them, actually, the pandemic has actually been of value to them. So they've actually targeted new consumer bases. They've actually redesigned their offer. So it's actually forced them to rethink their business offer, but also force them to think about what happens if another crisis hit. What are we going to do? Do we want to be caught off guard again, or do we want to do something different? So I think we need to think about the front of house and back of house and your consumer base and how you manage those different elements.
Thank you, Dr. Alisha. I think, wow, quite explained very well. I think I definitely should get some view from Dr. Aaron, because I saw his recent publication very close to the question. If I'm not mistaken, Dr. Aaron, it's almost the title almost very close to that. Can you share some findings from that?
Yeah, contactless service in what we call high touch service now is becoming almost like expected from what we call a revised service quality element. Well, regardless of the tourism or hospitality context, people now want to be safe and feel safe, where the physical elements as well as the whole process of check-in, check-out, and interactions become part of, their alarm system goes off if something is not there. So what we're starting to see is culturally as well, particularly from places where the pandemic has been managed fairly well, unlike others, they still necessarily want to have their distance, their space and all. And technology can fast track that, and we can see how these kinds of self-service check-in counters can actually reduce the wait time. We do know of restaurants and even hotels now where you can actually pay at your table or in your room and not necessarily queuing up at the concierge or the checkout to pay your bills and so on. So there are ways where technology actually supports that. The challenge in that space is the demonstration of warmth that we've talked about and the human-facing element. I think in many aspects of hotels and tourism as well, one of the first places that a visitor actually engages with is the airport. And the airports are very different now. I was recently at an airport and I think I almost forgot the whole airport experience, because you go in there and you realize, oh, you actually have to have your QR code or your boarding pass before you actually drop the luggage off. Then there's no one there except for maybe one or two others to troubleshoot bookings. Then you get into the customs area, and now you're going through almost like a conveyor belt. You just scan yourself through. They scan now either your fingerprint, your eyeball, your head, your heart. I don't know what else they scan. And you get this biometric process right through to the point where you board a plane and actually no one actually is spoken to you. Not a single word has been spoken to you. And you ask yourself like, well, what actually just happened? What is this radio silence? And should this be the case in the future? Because the less people we get in touch with, chances are the less we are likely to contact COVID. But that doesn't actually embrace the notion of hospitality. So we need to do a bit of a self-soul searching to understand whether or not what we're buying into is actually what may actually keep the workforce out of their jobs. because they do the repetitive tasks, but where do we fit in the human element into this world of contactless service? And that's the hard part, because if one robot can do the check-in work of three persons, then what do we do with these three persons that the work has been displaced? I I don't know. I'm still spending a bit of time watching the robots in the restaurant here, and I'm like, it's a very different world.
Thank you, Dr. Aaron. Yeah. Just one last question. Maybe we can get a very short response from you. The question is, looking from your opinion on cryptocurrencies, or generally consider anti-sustainability since it consumes huge amount of energy. I think this is mainly focused on to Dr. Aaron. Yeah.
Yeah, a key point. Prior to the pandemic, people were saying, "Oh, it's good. It helps to reduce the inefficiencies." They consume as much energy, if you're looking at the cost of encryption, to the amount of energy that's used in countries like Ireland or Denmark. So it's quite sizable. So what countries are now trying to do is to build what we call the sustainable, almost solar panels to power up and protect some of this encryption. So they have to be sourced, they have to be developed in places where they are more affordable. And we know that solar panel costs have a differential cost factor around the world. So they're trying to find out ways to actually go about to do this. My short response is, well, we've got to think of it as a circular economy. If I don't have the money to travel, you need someone to take travel photography. I'll fly in my drone, I'll use it, and in exchange, we can barter trade like food or other forms of travel discounts, for example.
Thank you, Dr. Aaron. Very important term, circular economy. When I was reading an article recently, even the ancient time, they recycle so many things as a circular economy. Okay, with this, we will move on to the next segment of our session. Thank you so much to both the speaker for being patient and answering to all the questions, and thanks to the participant for posting questions. Otherwise, this session may not be, this Q&A may not be as interesting as what has been done now. So moving on to the next is a quick summary. I'll try to keep it simple because I think during the Q&A we done very well. Let me start with the summary from Dr. Alisha. I think she started with a very interesting fact showing with two challenges. She put the challenge number one is whether will you be able to survive without the technology for 24 hours, or even whether during this summer school, during these 30 minutes of her presentation, are you able to focus only on her presentation, which we call mindfulness. I think it's very challenging, to be honest, right? Because we live in a disruptive world. And she also quoted a very interesting about the Oxford study from 2017 that we have been connected, every individual averagely. It's not only like mobile phone or anything. Even she quoted refrigerator, heaters, almost close to 15 devices, which is very interesting. And she covered the main stakeholders, three different stakeholders, which is a tourism planner, local communities, and the tourist with different elements. Very interesting. And the challenge too is she asked, as a tourist, it's a very important thing, as a tourist, what I can play a role to improve the consumption for sustainability. That's a very interesting, challenging questions, which I think everybody will start thinking on the three sustainability dimension you have shared: environmental, social, cultural, and economical perspective. I think finally you ended up with a very interesting critical success rate factor, the negative impact as well as on the digital divide. I think during the pandemic, everybody is still learning how to divide ourselves from the digital space, staying at home. Thank you so much for that interesting sharing, Dr. Alisha. Let me go to the second speaker summary, Dr. Aaron, which is more from an experiential, from his own experience. He started quoting from the technology in an accessible tourism perspective. And he started giving a lot of examples, starting from robotic pepper from Japan, how his recent experience is Brisbane in Australia. And very interesting, what I found is that I was muted all the time.
No, just a short one.
Okay, okay. I think during the Dr. Alisha, I was okay, or
Yeah,
just
you
now?
okay? Okay,
Okay.
yeah.
Maybe I think
robotics.
maybe Dr. Aaron sent some robot or drone to mute me, or he had done some blockchain management system. Okay, Dr. Aaron, I think you started with the interesting fact showing the real robot. Pepper is well known for everybody, and your recent experience in Bisborne. I think this triggers me about the revolution is moving towards Industry Revolution 5.0, which we call human augmentation era. Right? I think we are all moving towards the 5.0 era, human augmentation era. And the use of 3D printing, yes, it is in the market for a very long time, but people are not aware of it. But the one you showed is a very interesting from an animal perspective. Even in Germany, if I'm not mistaken, they built the bridge using the 3D. But how they are using in the hospitality industry, I think you have shown us very good example. On top of that, I would like to add one. I think even the hotel in Oberoi Hotel in India, they are using the 3D printing for creating souvenirs based on chocolates to take away for the customers with their own images and everything. And the one what I really enjoyed is the life below water. I think I remember before the pandemic there was a lot of conference on life below the water. I think you were shown about the drones, how animal immigration patterns has been observed. I think people who are living very close to seashore, I think it's a very interesting research area to focus marine tourism. Cryptocurrency, blockchains, SDG 11, and I think you have covered a lot of things, and especially the ethical dilemmas. Yeah, who owns all our data? Even we don't know. I think there is a big debate came when the Facebook, I think the Apple, everything, the big companies, the beta breach, data security, everything. That's an interesting point you have quoted. And the most important thing, what I liked, I think which benefits all the researchers and the young researchers, young academicians here, the topics you have shared at the end. The technology in accessible tourism, cross-cultural influence in technology, technology and intergenerational descriptions. I think thanks for sharing these topics. With this, I will let me go to the next dilemma. Thank you so much. The pooled results I am sharing to the participants now. Hope everyone can see the pooled results. Dr. Alisha and Dr. Aaron, this is the outcome of your questions. Question number 1, governments of developing nations are serious about sustainability and inclusivity. I think we got majority answer all the above. Gamification, virtual reality, I think people have started using it because the industry is moving like that. The second question, I think this is from Dr. Alisha. To what extent do you agree that technology can support local community in having a voice in tourism development? I think 57% people have agreed. I can even take agreed as a positive note. When we combine, it's 94%. It's a very good. And third question by Dr. Alisha is, which of this do you believe is the most significant barrier in the uptake of the technology for sustainable tourism development? I think most of them voted number 2 option, lack of understanding on the use of technology for sustainable tourism development. That's very true. People sometimes think technology is just to replace human. No, it has to be, it is just a device or tool to enhance your experience and services, right? Yeah. Number 4 by Dr. Aaron, to what extent are you willing to give up more privacy in exchange for technological efficacy, effectiveness and efficacy in tourism and hospitality? I think people have voted 30 and 29, altogether 59 I can say. 29 voted extremely willing, somewhat reluctant 30. Question number 5, to what extent are you willing to pay more as a consumer when technology serves as a vehicle for the SDG? I think people are extremely willing. That's very interesting. That means when the innovation happening, the people should accept the innovation. Last question, to what extent are we willing to engage with technology rather than human if it is more likely deliver hospitality or tourism sectors? I think 33% extremely willing. Thank you so much to both speakers for sending the questions to create this pool, and thanks to the participants for filling up this. Let's move on to the next one. We request the participants again to give your feedback in one word using the Slido. This is a QR code to access your Slido. Maybe I can keep it for a while. And the post, can I ask Ashin, our technician person, like to post also? And Now we have come to a very important, I think Dr. Alisha was mentioning about photography. I think it's a memory, right? So probably I will stop sharing. I request my another moderator, Ms. Zuratul, who has helped me for the questions, filtering the questions and sending to me from the Slido. Thank you, Ms. Zuratul. And can you take the digital photos?
You have to unpin, Dr. Kandupan. Okay.
Good to go now. Ms. Zuratul? Ms. Zuratul, please make some announcement if you are clicking. Otherwise, people will say probably don't give the space for robot to replace you. Can you unmute Dr. Ms. Zuratul? I think she's getting ready. Okay. Once done, let me know, Ms. Zuratul, the photo session done. Keep your human smile, good smile. I request Ashan also to take screenshots. Once done, please let me know. I think Zuratul is having some technical issues also. Okay, she took. Okay, let's. Are you excited to see the feedback of one word, Ms. Dr. Alisha and Dr. Aaron? So here we go. Okay, I think we got 90 response already. Just give us maybe another few seconds. Participants who missed to scan the QR code, it's there on the left side. You can take your smartphone, post your feedback in one word. Very interesting to see the technology is popping up with the bigger bubbles. So that means the outcome of the session is very fruitful. Excellent, ICT, informative. Technology is the future. Technology working with human is future. Probably human augmentation. Amazing innovation, sustainability is coming up to align the summer school theme. Okay, we just passed the lucky number 111, sorry. Okay, it's keep going. When it is keep posting. Maybe I will wait for another 10 seconds. Thank you, participants, for taking your time to post this one word feedback. You can still continue posting, but let me go to the final slide of today. Good, we are almost just 5 minutes delay in our completion only. Okay, since we have come to the end of the day, so I would like to, on behalf of CRiT, Taylor's University, and also being the collaborators, ATRA and UNWTO, and also School of Hospitality, Tourism and Events of Taylor's University,